My name's Mike Ryan. I'm a professor of integrative biology at the University of Texas, and I'm also a research associate at the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute, where I do a lot of my research. And what I've been studying is the evolution of sexual beauty under the context of Darwin's theory of sexual selection. Of a book that I have coming out right now, and it's not only about my research, but it talks about research in the field that's trying to understand the evolution of sexually attractive traits. So what I'm going to do is we're going to go to the next slide. I'm going to show you it's only a one minute or so video trailer for this book that just came out, and it gives you. They did a good job on it. It gives you a basic idea of what we'll be talking about in the next half hour. Right.
That's beautiful.
Yeah, so that gives you a little bit of a feel for what we're going to talk about this evening. And what I want to do is just cover a couple of the topics that I address in this book, and try to give you some understanding of current research into this field of the evolution of sexual beauty. Now, if we look at this slide, this shows a number of traits of extravagant beauty throughout the animal kingdom, and all of these traits share some similarities. They're usually involved in courtship and sexual communication. These traits actually seem to hinder rather than promote survivorship. And also, these traits are more developed in males than in females in many cases. Now, there are a lot of exceptions where females might be the more elaborately decorated gender. And also, there's many cases where the males and the females both invest heavily in sexual beauty. But in the animal kingdom, excluding humans right now, because we have mutual mate choice, in most of the animal kingdoms, the males are extravagantly adorned, and the females assess these adornments and decide with whom they want to mate. So one question that we have right away is, why are so many traits of sexual beauty sexually dimorphic? And what explains this very common difference between males and females? So just to give you one example here, if you look towards the bottom left-hand corner, you will see two pictures of lizards, and that's the male lizard on the top and the female lizard on the bottom. So quite often the males are more adorned. And why is this so? Well, what's interesting is that a lot of these differences all start with gamete size. Now, gamete size is actually what defines a male from a female. All of the other characters that we think as being typical of males or typical of females are actually secondary sexual characters. It's the gamete character, it's the size of the gamete that really determines biologically the difference between a male animal and a female animal. Now, males have many small gametes, while females have fewer larger gametes. What this means is that in many species, the males are under very strong selection to mate often because they will never run out of gametes, while females are, on the other hand, are under selection to mate carefully and make good use of the fewer gametes that they have. Because what we see in lots of mating systems are that males are competing for females, either through direct competition, fighting for instance, or, which is more common, by making themselves attractive to females, and females decide which males get to mate. And this latter phenomenon is the topic of this book. So most of the differences that we see between males and females, including at least some of the differences that we see between men and women, so in our own species, we can explain this by the difference in gamete size. So it's the gamete size that is the driving force that results in males evolving these beautiful sexual displays and females assessing these sexual displays and choosing with which male do they want to mate. Now, the peacock's tail, this has become something of a mascot for sexual selection and mate choice. Now, for most of us who are interested in nature, the peacock's tail inspires awe and wonderment. It's a magnificent sexual trait. But this actually wasn't so for Darwin. Darwin wrote a letter to the famous American botanist Asa Gray in which he confessed his revulsion for this biological icon of beauty. Every time I gaze at a feather in the peacock's tail, Darwin said, it makes me sick. So what was going on here? Why was Darwin repulsed by such a beautiful trait in nature? Well, it probably wasn't physical illness. Darwin was probably exaggerating, but also he was suffering a bout of cognitive dissonance. He had just developed his theory of natural selection, which went a long way to explain the evolution of traits that enhance survivorship. But how could something like the peacock's tail evolve when it would surely hinder and not promote the peacock's ability to survive? When you watch a peacock shaking its tail and displaying to the female, the male looks like such a magnificent organism. But if a fox or my kids, we would watch peacocks a lot, and my kids started to chase these males, and the males are pathetic trying to escape from a predator or from a child, dragging these long tails, and they can barely fly. They're obviously not designed for enhanced survivorship. They're really designed for enhanced beauty. So what Darwin realized is a lot of these sexually beautiful traits, again, which are mostly adorned males, that beauty kills. And the first problem is that beauty kills and dead animals don't mate. So how can these traits evolve if they actually decrease survivorship instead of enhance survivorship? So what I want to do now is, for the next couple of minutes, I want to dig into a system that my colleagues and I discovered some years ago, and it's a mating system that we think best exemplifies this trade-off between survivorship and beauty. So this animal that we've been studying for quite a long time is the tundra frog. This is a frog that inhabits much of tropical America, and it gathers at choruses where the males call for females. So we've just been hearing the call of a large number of tundra frogs, And these calls can have multiple syllables. Now, it's hard to discern the individual syllables of the frog's call when they're all calling. But what we're going to do now is we're going to listen to a call that has a whine. All the calls begin with a whine. And a male can make a whine by itself, or he can add up to 7 chucks to this whine. So we're going to hear now an isolated call, a whine with 1 chuck, a whine with 2 chucks, and then a whine with 3 chucks. So listen carefully. Now, if a male is calling by himself, he produces only a whine. If you go to a chorus of males, all of the males are adding chucks to their call. And they only add chucks if there's vocal competition. So if a male's in a small pool by himself, and he's calling, ear, ear. And if I were to say to him, ear, he'll answer me, but he answers, ear. And if I say, ear, he answers, ear. So they're competing with each other to add more chucks to their call. They're reluctant to add chucks, and they only do so through competition with other males. Now, if we bring a female into the laboratory and if we play her a whine from a speaker, the female hops right to the speaker, indicating that she would mate with this male even though he's making only a whine. But if you give the females a choice between a whine only, what we call a simple call, and a whine with a chuck, the females find the whine chuck 5 times more attractive than the whine. They're 500% more likely to respond to a whine chuck than to a whine when they're given a choice. So the question we were faced with then, if the males can all add chucks to their calls, which as far as we know, they can all do that, and if females are so much more attracted to chucks, why don't the males always make whines with chucks? And this is the answer, the frog-eating bat. So when the males are calling to attract the attention of females, their calls are also heard by eavesdroppers, and in this case, the eavesdropper is the frog-eating bat. The bats eat frogs, as we see here, and they also use the call to find the frogs. Now, like the female tungura frogs, the bats are attracted to a simple call, but when given a choice, they prefer complex calls to simple calls. So the males then are in a bind. They can add chucks to increase their attractiveness to females, but they do so at the risk of attracting frog-eating bats. Whereas the females are looking for a mate, the bats are looking for a meal. So what the frogs do, they adjust their sexual beauty and also their predation risk in real time. If there's bats around, they tend not to produce chucks. If the coast seems clear, they start adding lots of chucks to their calls. So this is one of the issues that critically concerned Darwin, this balance between survivorship and beauty. And what we show here is that these frogs are able to vary their beauty and their predation risk in real time. Now, if we want to understand why the peacock's tail is sexually beautiful to a peahen, or why a chuck is sexually beautiful to a tungura frog, we need to understand how male beauty is being perceived by females, because it's the females that decide what's beautiful. So, yes, indeed, as we often say, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but it's also in the ears and in the nares of the beholder. And all of this sensory stimulation is sorted out by the animal's sexual brain, where decisions about beauty are made. So more broadly, we can say that beauty is in the brain of the beholder. Now, all brains aren't the same. And as Picasso pointed out, different brains, in this case different human brains, can perceive beauty differently. Now, in this painting of the girl before a mirror, the girl's true beauty and that beauty reflected by the mirror are quite different from one another. So Picasso well understood that we all have different aesthetics and we can all find different images more or less beautiful. And this has been shown now with very different species of animals. And if we want to understand why and how animals assess beauty, we have to view these traits in some sense through the brain of the animal that's assessing beauty. So beauty is in the brain of the beholder, and the brain might be our most important sex organ, but the brain has other things on its mind besides sex. And these other things on its mind, these other tasks that the brain evolved to do, this can also influence perceptions of beauty. So what we're seeing here is a series of photographs of male wild guppies that populate the mountain streams of Trinidad. Now, as we see in these photos, the males have lots of colors, but the most dominant color is orange. And there's a lot of variation amongst males in the degree of orange, both within populations within a stream or among populations in different streams. Now, for many years, researchers asked, what was it about orange that made the males more attractive? And they were especially interested in whether or not orange males somehow had better genes for survivorship. But a number of years ago, researchers found that these fishes were feeding primarily on orange fruits that were falling from the trees above the stream into the water. When they fell into the water, the guppies would go up and feed on the orange fruit. So then they did a very clever experiment. In the lab, they put poker chips of different colors in the aquarium with both male and female guppies. And they measured the amount of time that the guppies spent inspecting each of these different colors. And what they showed is that both males and females very much preferred this orange color on the poker disc. So the interpretation of the researchers was that the guppies, both the males and the females, evolved this interest, this bias towards orange colors. And once this sensory bias was in place, the males then evolved orange coloration to appear more attractive to the females by exploiting this sensory bias in their own females, this sensory bias for orange. So this is one example of how other aspects of an animal's biology can influence, in a very incidental way, what females might find attractive. Now, one thing that we know about attractiveness in our own species is that our perceptions of attraction can be quite fickle. Now, in an old country and western song, Mickey Gilley asked, do the girls really get prettier at closing time? And what his idea was is a man goes into a bar early in the evening and he has certain thresholds of what he considers beautiful. And in this song, this is a very misogynist song, but he's assigning ratings of 1 to 10 of the female patrons at the bar. And in this song, the lonely cowboy, who at the end of the night is not with a woman, he starts to change what he considers sexually attractive. But that's just a song. Do the girls and also the boys get prettier at closing time? And the answer is yes, they sure do. So there is a study conducted in Virginia of both men and women, and they surveyed these patrons of a bar early in the evening, and they asked them to rate the sexual attractiveness of members of the opposite gender early in the evening and then later in the evening. And what they found was that both men and women rated individuals as more attractive as closing time in the bar approached. Now, this is a classic study, and it was repeated more recently in Australia, where they measured blood alcohol levels because some had thought that perhaps this perception of increased sexual beauty at closing time was due to having what's referred to as beer goggles, because the patrons were drinking through the night. Well, in this study in Australia, they measured the blood alcohol levels early in the evening and later in the evening, and they found that even when controlling for the effects of blood alcohol levels, there really was a strong, what we call a closing time effect. So this shows how preferences don't necessarily need to be fixed, but in this case, in humans, can change through the night. Now, animals actually show a similar pattern. So as I noted before, male tundra frogs gather in small pools where they call for females. Now, the females only come to the pond on the night they are going to mate. If they don't choose a mate that night, all of their eggs are just dropped into the water unfertilized, and all of their reproductive investment is wasted, and it takes them another 6 weeks to yolk up the eggs for another mating attempt. If they do have a male, then as we see in the bottom right-hand corner, the males assist the female fertilizing the eggs while they build this foam nest. So we did a very simple experiment. We tested females early in the evening, and we presented them with a single call, which from previous research, we knew that this call was unattractive. So when we tested females with this call early in the evening, very few females would hop to that speaker, would indicate any interest in that call. But when we played the same females, the same call, later in the evening, closer to the quote-unquote closing time, where they would have to mate or just drop their eggs, at that time, the females now found these calls very attractive. So like the men and the women in the bar, the female tundra frogs' perception of beauty are quite fickle, and they change as closing time approaches. So it seems that male frogs also get prettier at closing time. Now, another way that preferences vary is because of peer pressure. And I'm going to show you a clip from a very popular movie to highlight what I mean by this phenomenon that we're going to call mate choice copying. So this will just take a second for me to get this up.
I was thinking maybe we could go out sometime. No, you're a dork. I mean, law school. Look, I'm not going to go out with you. I can't believe you'd even ask. Girls like me don't go out with losers like you. Let's get out of here. Excuse me. Why didn't you call me? What? We spent a beautiful night together, and then I never hear from you again? I'm sorry? Sorry for what? For breaking my heart or for giving me the greatest pleasure I've ever known and then just taking it away? Both? Well, forget it. I've already spent too many hours crying over you. So, when did you want to go out?
So I'm sure many of you have seen that movie, Legally Blonde, and that's a wonderful example of how our perceptions of attraction can be molded by what other people find attractive. And it ends up that this phenomenon, which we call mate choice copying, is not restricted to humans. And I want to show you an example of some experiments that we did to demonstrate mate choice copying in fishes. So this fish that you're looking at here is called a molly. It's a sailfin molly. And it's a fish that's very common in Mexico. It comes up into Texas, around the Gulf Coast, and then up to about North Carolina. So we did this very simple experiment. We put a female molly in the middle of a tank, and on the left and the right we placed male mollies who were separated from the female by a clear glass plate. So the males could court the female through this plate, and the female would spend various amounts of time with either male. So we would quantify the amount of time she spent with each male, and what we found is that the females preferred to be courted by the larger male. That's the male on the right. We then put the female back in the center of the aquarium in a clear glass tube so she could see the males again, but she couldn't approach them. We then placed each of those males with a female in their own compartment, but separated by another pane glass. So the males were courting these females that were adjacent to them, but as you see on the top right of this bottom aquarium, the female's vision of the preferred male with his female was blocked. So she could still see that larger male, but she could not see that he was courting a female. The smaller male, the less preferred male, could be observed now courting a female. So after 10 minutes, the females were removed and we repeated the preference test. And now what we showed is that the female changed her preference towards the less preferred male. So in stage 1, before there was the mate choice copying opportunity, the females only responded to the less preferred male about 20% of the time. And after she observed that male being courted by a female, she now spent almost 45% of her time with the female. So what we see here is that just like the women from Legally Blonde, this female changed her preferences based on the behavior of other females. Again, this is called mate choice copying, and it's been demonstrated in a large number of animals, and it's also been demonstrated in humans in a variety of ways. Now, one thing that we know about courtship in humans is that males will often try to deceive females. For example, people have analyzed internet dating sites, and what they find is that males usually report that they're taller than they really are, that they're lighter than they really are, and also that they make more money than they really do. So deception is widespread in human courtship. Well, what about animals? Well, throughout the animal kingdom, we see that males have a number of tricks to deceive females for the purpose of mating. Now, this fish that we're seeing here is called a swordtail characin, and this is another fish from the wilds of Trinidad. Now, the male is on the right, and it looks as if the male is trying to lure the female in with a shish kebab that has a piece of meat at the end. Well, that piece of meat actually is the male's own flesh. And he extends this spine from his pectoral fin with this piece of flesh, his own flesh, on the end of this spine, and he waves it towards the female, and the female comes over and will try to nip at, will try to bite this decoy. And when she does, then she's close enough for the male to start courting her. So that's one kind of deception that we see. There's another kind of deception that's very nefarious. So on the top, this is a corn borer moth. Now these males can make high frequency clicks to court the females. Now these clicks sound very much like echolocation calls in bats. Now if we could hear a bat using its echolocation calls to approach an insect, this is what we would hear. And as the bat got closer, those pulses would get very close together. And it would end up like this in a feeding buzz as the bat goes in for the kill. Well, the moths do the same thing. They approach a female, and they start to make clicks, and then they make clicks that are so fast they sound like the feeding buzz of a bat. Now, a female has evolved to freeze and not to move when they hear these feeding buzzes, so they don't give themselves away to the bat. So the male imitates these bat feeding buzzes. The female moth freezes, and while she's immobile, the male climbs on top of her and mates with her, getting no resistance from this female who appears to be scared to death. Scared not of the male moth, but of what she thinks is a bat homing in on her for the kill. So there's lots of deception going on between males and females of different animal species. But such trickery is not restricted to animals of the same species, and it's not even restricted to organisms of the same kingdom. So what we see here is a male orchid bee who is trying to mate with a male orchid. Why? Well, the orchid produces chemicals that mimic odors of the female, and its flower parts visually resemble the silhouette of a female bee. So they deceive the male into thinking that the flower is actually a female. So while this male bee is having sex with the plant, he picks up pollen on his body, and that pollen is then transferred to the next orchid that dupes the male into mating. Now, one might think that the bee should be able to figure this out. But here's the problem. The male bee could make two kinds of mistakes when it comes to identifying an appropriate mate. The male bee could mate with a plant thinking that it's really a female. That's a mistake, and that kind of mistake is called a false alarm. The other kind of a mistake is the male bee could pass up a real female thinking that it's a plant. And this kind of mistake is called a miss. Now, in orchid bees, it's very hard for males to find females. Females are very hard to come by. So the cost of these two mistakes, a false alarm and a miss, are not equivalent. It would be much worse for a male to pass up a real female than it would be for him to occasionally mate with a plant. So that's probably why this plant deception works so well, because it's hard to find females, and males would much rather occasionally mate with a plant than let a real female get away. Now, what we're seeing in a lot of these cases is that males, and even in this case plants, can evolve traits that exploit some kind of what we call a hidden preference in the animal that's doing the choosing. And we call this phenomenon sensory exploitation. And a classic example of sensory exploitation occurs in mate choice in swordtail fishes and platyfishes. Now, swordtails, as we can see on this family tree on the right-hand side, swordtails are all most closely related to one another. And all swordtails, we don't see all the species here, we only see one, but all of the dozen or so species of swordtails have swords. Platyfish are the most closely related fish to swordtails, and that's what we see in the bottom picture here. Platyfish look like swordtails without swords. And the sword evolved, as far as we can tell, when the swordtails and the platyfishes diverged from one another. And we can see on this family tree where the sword first evolved, where the sword develops. Now, Alex Basolo asked a very insightful question. If platyfish had swords, would females have a preference for a sword? So she took a male platyfish and she attached to that male platyfish a plastic sword resembling the sword of a swordtail. And she gave the female platyfish a choice between their normal swordless male and males with these newfound swords. And what they found is that the female platyfish actually had a preference for swords, even though swords had yet to develop. And the two platyfish she tested it with are these two Xiphophorus right next to the swordtail Xiphophorus helleri. Helleri is the swordtail, and Maculatus and Variatus are the platyfish, and those females had preferences for swords. In fact, two other kinds of fishes, Priapella and mollies, Poecilia, also had preferences for swords, even though swords had not developed yet in these fishes, even though it had not evolved. So what that suggests to us and to Basolo is that when swords evolve, there is already a latent or a hidden preference for females to start evolving swords. Now, the last topic I wanted to address was this very bizarre relationship between sexual attraction in animals and attraction to pornography in humans. So this is a male quail, and this is a very rough model of a female quail. Now, psychologists did conditioning experiments. In an arena, they present males with this toy. For now, we'll call it a sex toy. And then several minutes after this sex toy was presented, a real female was introduced to the arena, and the males would then mate with the real females. So the males became conditioned to understand that when these toy quails appeared, that pretty soon there would be a real female coming into the arena. So the males would approach this dummy quail, hang around the dummy quail, and then as soon as the female quail came, they would mate with the female quail. Not all of the males did this, however. A smaller number of males became a little too conditioned to the dummies, and these males would actually try to copulate with the dummies, and they would ignore real females even when the real females were in the arena. So in these males, the toy, the dummy, became a sexual fetish, and the male quails actually preferred the sexual fetish to the real thing. And this is what some medical researchers think is happening with compulsive viewing of pornography. Now, women as well as men can view pornography, but compulsive viewing of pornography appears more in men than it does in women. Now, men will masturbate while watching pornography, and the resulting orgasm causes a severe jolt to the dopamine reward system. Now, this is the same reward system that's implicated in addiction to gambling and cocaine and overeating. So what some medical researchers think is happening is that the orgasm causes the males to become conditioned to viewing pornography, and that in the compulsive viewing of pornography, some men eventually develop a preference for pornography over real women. And this phenomenon of compulsive pornographic viewing, or some researchers insisted it's an addiction. It's not yet classified as an addiction. But this prompted the feminist author Naomi Wolf to declare that because of pornography, for the first time in human history, the images, power, and allure have supplanted that of real naked women. Today, real naked women are just bad porn. And a lot of medical researchers are quite concerned about a cohort of young men now who might be compulsively or addicted to viewing of pornography, and what this is going to do to sexual relations with males and females. And it's certainly a very controversial area. It's not one that I have a very strong opinion about, but it's a very interesting phenomenon about how sexual beauty in animals can go awry. So there's much more to sexual beauty that I haven't had time to discuss, but I hope this overview has piqued your interest in giving you some insights into the incredible diversity of beauty that surrounds us in nature. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Ryan. While you were speaking, quite a few questions came in that I'd like you to address, if that's okay. A couple people wanted to hear the frogs again, and have you say which is the wine and which is the chuck.
Okay, let me get that back up. And the wine is, as I'm doing this, the wine is the first component of the call. Okay, so we'll hear that little chorus first. I'm sorry, just a sec. This will just take a second. I was stuck in the presentation. Okay, so first we're going to hear a bunch of calls at the same time. And there's two parts. There's a whine, which sounds like this, and then the whine is followed by chucks. So a whine with chucks would sound like this. So we'll hear a lot of calls at the same time first. And when you first hear these calls in nature, you think that there's two different species calling. It sounds like there's one species calling, and then another species in the same pool calling, but in fact, these are parts of the same call. So now we'll listen to those same calls. We'll listen to a real whine, a whine with one chuck, a whine with two chucks, and a whine with three chucks. Okay, so here it goes. So does that help?
Yeah, I think the first one you put sounds like an ambulance, like a lot of different ambulances. It doesn't sound like what I would think a frog sounds like.
No, we always, and this is a long time ago that we first started working with this. We always thought it sounded like these old video games.
Oh yeah, Space Invaders.
Exactly.
So here's another question. They were wondering if there are any other predators, or just the bats that you showed and mentioned.
No, there are, and one very interesting predator, which I didn't talk about, I talk about it in my book, is a blood-sucking fly.
Blood-sucking
fly. Yeah, or sometimes they call them midges. They're about the size of mosquitoes, and we always thought they were mosquitoes. And we would see them on the backs of males. And then one of my former students who's at Purdue now. Her name is Jimena Bernal. She works on them now, and what we found when Jimena was a student is that these were midges, and they were also attracted to the calls of males. But it's a very different system. So the female midges land on the back of the frogs, and they walk around the back of the frog, and then they go, the skin of these frogs is like a toad. It's fairly tough skin, but what these midges do, they walk around to the front of the frog, and they go in the male's nose, and they pierce the capillaries in the nose, and then they take a blood meal. So very much like the frogs, these flies are attracted to the calls, and like the frogs and like the bats, the flies are attracted to speakers that are producing only wines. But if you put speakers out in the field with wines from one speaker and wine chucks from another speaker, you collect many, many more flies at the speaker producing a wine with chucks. There's other predators too. There's opossums. There's a mustelid, a weasel-like animal in Panama called a tyra. There's other large bullfrog types of frogs in Panama that all eat tundra frogs. We think they go to their calls, but we haven't done the experiments showing that they prefer complex calls over simple calls.
I see. And here's another question. In the frog studies, you mentioned dichotomous choice test. Have you explored the decoy effect and introduced a third frog?
Yes, that's an excellent question. And we
Thank
certainly
you, Jennifer.
we certainly did that experiment, and there is a decoy effect. So just for folks who might not know what the decoy effect is, one of the assumptions of rational economic theory, so we're talking about humans now. Well, two of the most important assumptions is one is that decisions are transitive. So if we prefer A to B and we prefer B to C, then we should prefer A to C. And then another assumption is that there is no decoy effect. So our relative preference for A versus B should not be affected by the presence of a third option, C. We know in humans that that is violated a lot, and that we are influenced by these decoys. So we did an experiment with the frogs. We gave them two calls, A versus B, and there's about a 50% preference. Half the females went to A and half the females went to B. We then gave them a choice with a third speaker. So now instead of hearing they would go through three speakers, and we'll call that call C. And we knew from previous studies that call C was a very unattractive call. Nevertheless, when we gave them a trinary choice, a choice between three calls instead of two calls, the females hardly ever went to call C, but now they had a very strong preference for call B over call A. So in the absence of C, in the absence of the decoy, they equally prefer A versus B, but in the presence of the decoy, they now strongly prefer B to A. And we did that experiment not that long ago, just a few years ago.
Wow, great question. Thank you very much.
So whoever asked that question, that was very insightful. Thank you.
She might be a future TIES presenter, according to my associate, so I'm very happy to have her along. Here's I guess you might have answered this after they asked the question, but how do you explain people considering as more attractive by closing time? People they didn't find attractive at the beginning of the night? Is it really a perception that changed with time, or as the closing time approaches and one hasn't found a mate, the sexual need as a powerful drive muddles the rational thinking for the purpose of evolutionary urge for procreation?
That's a possible explanation. And not counter to that explanation is the more psychological explanation that the researchers give. And their idea, the person who did this study, he did it in Virginia. He was at the University of Virginia, but it ends up that he's at my university now. And I didn't even know that when we were doing these studies. But what he suggests is that humans like to avoid cognitive dissonance. That is conflict between facts that don't make sense. So the idea he suggests is that and let's talk about from the man's point of view, because that's probably more common. The man goes into a bar. Sounds like a joke, I know, but the man goes into a bar and he has very, very high opinion of himself. And he's only going to settle for what he thinks is the most attractive woman in the bar. Well, a lot of these women aren't around towards closing time, and they're certainly not leaving with him. They're leaving with other people in this scenario. So now you have this guy at the bar, and there's other women there. There's these, what he used to think of, and this is misogynist, and I apologize for this, but this is how the scenario goes. All of what he considered the tens are no longer there. So if he wants to go home with the woman, he can do one of two things. He can just consciously change his thresholds, change his standards. Well, it wouldn't be that bad to go home with a 4 or a 5. Or he can deceive himself, and he could look at a woman, he can consider a woman who earlier in the evening he rated as a 5, and he can say, now that woman's a 10, I'll go home with her, and I'm not going to change my standards at all. So the psychologists think this is an adaptation to avoid cognitive dissonance. Now, that doesn't mean that this also is not related to sexual motivation, which could be favored by selection, resulting in the men to reproduce more often. The psychological idea of avoiding cognitive dissonance, that could be the underlying psychological mechanism that selection favors, because it ends up with these lonesome cowboys actually ending up with someone at the end of the night and having the chance to reproduce.
I was answering a question in there. Somebody's asking you about gender versus sex, the term gender versus the term sex. And she noticed you use them a little interchangeably. Is there anything
yeah, I mean, these terms, unfortunately, in biology even, these terms are being used inappropriately. So sex is the biological situation of having large gametes or small gametes. So large gametes, individuals with large gametes are the male sex, and individuals with small gametes are the female sex. Gender refers to culturally acquired behaviors and even morphologies that we typically, and many times quite erroneously, identify as being sex specific. So with animals, it actually doesn't make much sense to talk about genders. And I'll just give you 2 examples of people who who feel very strongly about this and have made the same argument that I'm making. Both Richard Dawkins and Steven Pinker. Pinker, if you aren't familiar with Pinker, he's also a very popular science writer. Dawkins and Pinker point out that it really doesn't make sense to talk about gender when we're talking about animals.
Okay, that's great. Well, we have superseded our time. We did have a bad start, but we did do a full hour. I don't want to keep you, Dr. Ryan. You've been wonderful. You had a mix of biology students, biology teachers, a few biology professors, and just some plain old science lovers in this seminar tonight. So
this is certainly my pleasure.
And thank you for working with me through the techie issues. Everybody, Dr. Ryan was really brave to be our first featured guest speaker here on the TIES webinar series, and I'm very grateful for that. And if I had to be stuck working on emails and passwords and usernames, he was certainly a very nice, patient guy to to be stuck with me. So I really appreciate that. And I'm going to leave the seminar room open because if you look down here, you could purchase a copy of A Taste for the Beautiful just in time for Valentine's Day. This link will take you to Amazon. Thank you, Kenny, for opening that up. And if you want to learn more about the Teacher Institute for Evolutionary Science, there's a link for that as well. So if you'd like to say goodbye, I don't want to close out.
Okay. Okay. Well, thank you very much. This is very enjoyable and this is a lot of fun.
Thank you so much. Have a good evening.
Okay, you too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. This concludes our first featured presentation of the TIES webinar series, Dr. Michael Ryan, author of A Taste for the Beautiful.